I have some fun books about some grandmas. Since I'm a grandma, I have 13 grandchildren. Pray for my grandson, Ben. He and his new wife are on the island of Zanzibar. It's in the Indian Ocean off the coast of Africa. And they have been on lockdown also with coronavirus. So pray for Ben there in that country. They don't have the kind of medicines that we do. And so far, Ben and Kelsey are well. But we ask that you'll pray for them. But Mrs. Moon is also a grandma, and she has adventures. Miss Pickerel is another one of our grandmas, and she goes to the Arctic, she goes to Mars, she goes to the moon, she goes all kinds of places. So these are really fun. Mrs. Moon's Polliwogs. You know what a pollywog is? It is a tadpole. You know what a tadpole is? Okay, so here's our picture, and there's a boy with the jar. One day, Mrs. Moon went on a trip to her friend's house in the country. Tony and Maria went with her. So did William and little Tara from India. They all lived in apartments. The apartments were in a brownstone house in the city. Mrs. Moon wore a skirt and a jacket, and the kids wore warm jackets. The sun will be warm soon. It feels like a good spring day. And here they are on the bus. William carried a glass jar that had a cover. So did Tony and Maria and Tara. They took the subway at the B station. On the subway, all the people looked at the boys and girls with empty glass jars. A lady said to Maria, "Why are you carrying those jars?" "They are for eggs," said Maria. "Eggs," said the lady. "The eggs will hatch into pollywogs," said Tony. "And the pollywogs will grow into toads or frogs," said William. "Then what will you do with the toads and the frogs?" asked the lady. "Oh, I don't know," said Maria. "We'll have to think about it." "We'll think about it all the time that they are growing up." They got off the subway and took a bus. In half an hour, they were in the country. They saw trees and fields. "There's a cow," said Tony. "And a horse," said Maria. "And some chickens," said William. When boys and girls live in the city, they don't get to see animals out very much, and they always get really excited. "Cow, horse, chickens," said Tara. Tara was learning to speak English. Mrs. Moon's friend met them at the bus. Her name was Mrs. Buckles. She had a big station wagon. It would be like an SUV today. She drove them to her home. "Come in and have some milk and cookies before you go hiking," said Mrs. Buckles. "Then I'll show you the way to the brook." The milk and cookies were very good. Soon they were ready to go hiking. The sun was getting warmer. "I wish we could go wading in the brook," said Maria. "Oh, it would be icy cold," said Mrs. Moon. "But maybe we can come back in the summer." The brook was very wide. It had trees and bushes near it. In some places, the bottom was sandy. In some places, it was stony. In some places, the water was very quiet. The boys and girls set their glass jars down on the ground. "Where will we find toad eggs?" asked Tony. "Where will we find frog eggs?" asked Maria. "How will we know which is which?" asked William. "I like this brook," said Tara. Mrs. Buckles said, "I saw some frog eggs yesterday, and they were near the other side." They walked along the bank of the brook, and then Tara said, "Look, some ribbons." "Well," said Mrs. Moon, "Tara has found some toad eggs." So the toad eggs are in like a long ribbon. Every little black dot was an egg. They picked up some of the ribbons of eggs, and they put them in the glass jar. "Put some water in," said Mrs. Moon. "And lots of green plant stuff for the tadpoles to eat." "Tadpoles?" said William. "I thought we were going to get pollywogs." "Pollywogs or tadpoles are all the same thing." "And we need some frog eggs too," said Maria. "Well, there they are way over there," said Mrs. Buckles. "But there isn't a bridge to get over the brook." "Oh dear, and we can't go wading?" They could see the frog eggs in a mass of clear jelly. The jelly had black dots in it. If we can only get to the other side. Mrs. Moon saw a long pole on the ground. This will be handy, she said. What are you going to do? Asked Maria. I'm going to try something, said Mrs. Moon. Here she is, the grandma, and she's trying this. Oh, this looks so fun. She stepped back a little. Then she ran toward the brook, put the pole down at the bottom of the brook, and used the pole to jump all the way across and land on the other side. Oh, my goodness. Why, Mrs. Moon, cried Maria. You can jump better than we can, said Tony. We didn't know you could jump like that. I used to run and jump in my school days, said Mrs. Moon. I was on the track team. I want to learn to jump with a pole, said Maria. Well, I'm over here. Now I need a jar for the eggs. Throw one over. It might break, said William. I'll catch it, said Mrs. Moon. William tossed a jar, and Mrs. Moon caught it. My goodness, said Maria. Were you on the baseball team too? Yes, said Mrs. Moon, laughing. She picked up some frog egg jelly and a lot more green plant stuff. Now, I'm going to have to jump back. But you can't jump with a jar full of eggs. How can we get the jar back on the other side of the brook? Mrs. Moon put a hand in the pocket of her jacket. She pulled out a ball of strong string. I always carry string on a hike. Do you think this will help? Oh, yes, said Tony. Throw us one end of the string and tie the other end to the jar, said William. Mrs. Moon did, but the string would not go far enough. It dropped into the water every time. Tie a little stone onto the end, said Maria. Mrs. Moon did. Then she could toss the string all the way to the other side of the brook. Tony caught it. Mrs. Moon tied her end around the jar near the top. She set the jar in the water. Now pull very carefully, she said. Tony pulled. The jar floated in the water, and he pulled it to the other side of the brook. Then, here she goes. Mrs. Moon backed up, and she ran to the brook and jumped across it again with her pole. I'm glad you didn't fall in, said Maria. Now we can go home, said Tara. Yes, it's time we did. In a few days, the eggs were all hatched into polliwogs. William kept the frog tadpoles in his apartment. Tony and Maria kept some of the toad tadpoles in their apartment. Tara had a few toad tadpoles in her apartment, and so did Rebecca and Dan, who lived upstairs. Every Wednesday, they brought the polliwogs to Mrs. Moon's story hour in her apartment, so everyone could see how they were growing. Mrs. Moon read many books to them about frogs and toads. I just read you one about frog and toad that went to outer space, didn't I? Soon they needed larger jars. William got some gallon jars with wide tops from Mr. Short, the grocer. Then the polliwogs had more room to swim. See them in there? They look almost like a little submarine. Every Wednesday, the boys and girls said, the polliwogs will become frogs and toads. What can we do with the frogs and toads? They didn't know what to do with them. They will have to live in the air then instead of water, said William. And they will have to eat insects and bugs instead of green plant food. They might die if we don't take proper care of them, said Maria. The boys and girls didn't know what to do. The polliwogs grew bigger and bigger. One day, Tara said, my pollywog grew legs. One of mine has legs too, said William. 2 of ours have legs. And they all looked at the new hind legs of the tadpoles. Another day, they found some polliwogs with hind legs and front legs too. The tails were getting smaller. They were looking more and more like little toads. Tony put a stick in his jar. It floated on the water. If one gets to be a toad, he could climb up on the stick, said Tony. Oh dear, we have to do something soon, said Maria. Mrs. Moon, "What shall we do?" asked William. "Well, what do you think?" asked Mrs. Moon. "I think we should take them all back to the brook before they turn into frogs and toads." "That's a very good idea," said Mrs. Moon. "But these gallon jars are so big and heavy, how can we carry them on the subway?" asked Maria. "That's so," said Mrs. Moon. "I will call my friend Mrs. Buckles. Perhaps she can come and get us in her station wagon." The next afternoon, Mrs. Buckles came with her car to get the 10 boys and girls who went to Mrs. Moon's story hours. And now they're taking all the children in the apartment buildings. They put covers on the gallon jars so the water wouldn't spill out. They held the jars so they wouldn't tip over. Mrs. Buckles had a little wagon at her house in the country. It had belonged to her boy when he was young. William pulled it, and Tony pushed. The wagon carried the jars of tadpoles back to the brook. Everyone watched while Maria and Tara tipped the big jars into the water. All the polliwogs swam away as fast, except one. That one swam to the bank and crawled out. "It's a toad!" cried Tony. "One of the tadpoles had turned into a toad." "I guess we got them here just in time," said Mrs. Moon. "Tomorrow there will be more toads crawling out of the water." "And the next day there will be more," said Maria. "But now they will know how to take care of themselves." "Now they will be happy," said Tara. "And so we can be happy too," said William. "But I will miss those polliwogs just the same." You know what? Polliwogs and the frogs and toads lay their eggs in the spring. So you be watching when you find some water, and get outside and go look for things. I love frogs. I love to hear them croak. When I was a little girl, my great aunts, 3 of them, lived 3 doors down from me, and right beside of their house was a little empty lot, and it had a little creek running through it, and that place was full of frogs, and they would croak and croak. And my great aunt used to say, "You know what they're doing?" She said, "They're having church." And she would tell me that when the frogs were croaking, they were thanking God for their water and their food. And sometimes at night, there would just be it sounded like 100 frogs croaking and croaking and croaking. And my great aunt would say, "Oh, they're having church again," and they're all singing. So you get outside, listen, look for spring, go walk around and see what all you can see, and look for all of God's wonderful creations in the springtime.